It is a genuine honor for me to introduce my good friend and colleague, Ellen Davis. I first encountered her work 20 years ago nearly in a rather obscure place called the Land Report. She had written a lovely essay about God's love for the soil, and I knew at that moment that we would be good friends. Ellen is Amos Ragan Kearns Distinguished Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke, and has written many, many books, and I don't need to list them all. You can find them easily online. But what I wanted to say by way of introduction is coming to know Ellen has also been a true revelation to me in the sense that it has helped me understand how these scriptures are living documents in which people encounter the fundamental questions of our time and of our humanity shared in this place called home. And students flock to her work, colleagues flock to her work, because one senses in her reading and her elucidation of texts a great love for the people who produce the texts and the places that produce these texts. And one senses also a spirit that is so hospitable, which is part of the reason I think why she has been so involved with interfaith dialogue over these last several years. And so it is a great privilege to me to introduce my friend, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say, Ellen. So I pass it on to you now.
Thank you, Norman. It's a great pleasure to me to share this occasion with you. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. I trust that is visible to people. Good. Okay. My intention is simple: to set forth some basic elements of a biblical view of the nature of the physical world, and especially the nature of arable land, because I think the perspective of the biblical writers throws into relief the sickness that our industrial culture has bred in the human spirit in this age we are learning to call the Anthropocene. I begin with a first principle. Land is a fountain of life, the fountain of life. This is a Hebrew phrase that may have been proverbial in ancient Israel, as it occurs in 5 different poems in both Psalms and in those books it refers to the gifts of God bestowed upon humans. The biblical writers do not use the phrase Makor Chaim, fountain of life, specifically with respect to land, but I think they would accept that application. I use it thus under the influence of the seminal ecological thinker Aldo Leopold, whose usage of the word land coheres closely with that of the biblical writers. For all of them, Eretz, land, is not just territory. It is an inclusive term that encompasses fertile soil and all the living communities that a thriving ecosystem support. It is, in Leopold's words, a fountain of energy, flowing through a sustained circuit, like a slowly augmented, revolving fund of life. That image of a circuit of life sustained in no small part by death comes home to us most directly in the familiar words from the 3rd chapter of the Bible: dust you are, and to dust you shall return. That statement, spoken to the first humans, is a sobering reminder of our finitude, and at the same time of the inescapable elemental earthiness of human life, something no Israelite could forget for long, since virtually all of them were small farmers involved on a daily basis in the difficult business of working the soil of the uplands of Canaan, now known as the hill country of Israel and Palestine. A second element of a biblically informed perspective on land. Farming fragile land well is a craft, cultivated and sustained over generations, In the terms used by the biblical writers, bringing forth bread from the earth is a practice of traditional chokhmah, wisdom. As you can see from these photos, farming these uplands is literally uphill work. Ancient Israelites occupied a land that in most places was marginal for an agrarian population. The land of Israel was small, mountainous, semi-arid. Even before global warming, 4 years out of 10 were drought years on average. The topsoil on the limestone frame of Israel and Judah is rich but thin. Unlike the Nile Valley, soil is measured here in inches, not feet. This physical fact shaped their mindset. This brings us to what may be the chief principle of a biblical land ethic, namely the principle of sufficiency, not excess, with zero tolerance for waste. This principle is inscribed in the seminal story of manna in the wilderness, the institution of Israel's wilderness economy. Ideally, the economy of a people living in dignity and freedom. And there are just two rules. One, every household can gather what it needs just for one day. To use a phrase from the New Testament, give us this day our daily bread. The Israelite tent is the antithesis of the great store cities of Egypt, where all the agricultural wealth of the empire was secured. A second rule of the manna economy is that no manna falls on Sabbath, in contrast to the ceaseless imperial machine of Egypt or of modern industrialism. It is also a reminder, the cessation of manna is a reminder that food is not a commodity, but a gift. Always and everywhere, food comes from God. Give us this day our daily bread. That is fundamentally a prayer of agricultural economics. And if food is not reducible to a commodity, then neither is land. Land, arable land, is the basis of the whole Israelite economy. And precisely for that reason, it is not subject to the whims of the marketplace. From a biblical perspective, land is a God-given trust, granted not to an individual, but to a family, a clan, a tribe, generation to generation. The trust is given on the condition of wise and kindly use, to adapt a phrase from Wendell Berry. The divine aim in making that land grant to Israel is stated in the 2nd chapter of the Bible. And the Lord God took the human and set him in the Garden of Eden. Eden means delight in Hebrew. Set him in the Garden of Delight, le'ovda u'leshomcha. I hesitate to translate that because the most common translation is not an acceptable translation. To till it and to tend it. Neither one of those terms, le'ovda u'leshomcha, avad and shamar, neither one of them is an agricultural term, nor even a gardening term. Both of those are exceedingly common verbs. They occur hundreds of times in the Bible. And the first of them, avad, means to serve someone or something, usually someone, a master, divine, or human. The second verb means to observe or preserve something with the greatest care. And the most common object of that verb, shamar, in the Bible is the ordinances of God. So this ultra-resonant phrase, le'ovda u'leshomcha, could well be translated to work it and to watch it, to serve it and to observe it, to serve it and to preserve it. From that statement of divine intention, we might draw two important inferences. One, in the ideal condition, which is what the garden represents, humans are meant to work the land, l'ovda, and at the same time, l'shambra, to serve its needs and not just our own needs or desires. Indeed, the needs of the land and the real needs of human communities coincide. We exist and flourish in an essential symbiosis. And if we fail to acknowledge that reciprocal relationship, then neither land nor humans will flourish for long. A second inference. Land is not an it in the simple sense, not an inert thing to be acted upon according to our own preferences. Rather, land is a creature of God, to be respected, observed, and protected. Unlike the humans it supports, the land itself is fragile, yet potentially productive. And like them, it is valuable beyond price. I note one final element of the biblical view of land, namely that it is not only a site of human flourishing, but at the same time, a site of contestation and threat from powers both domestic and foreign. The domestic threat came to the fore in Israel in approximately the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era. That period marks a major shift in the land economy of Israel and Judah, away from localized subsistence-level agriculture to a centralized economic system under crown control. It is no coincidence that the prophetic movement gained momentum at this time. The great 8th century prophets, Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, and Micah, all speak out in strident terms about land grabs, small farmers collapsing under an intolerable tax burden, formerly independent farmers driven off their land or reduced to the status of slaves serving absentee landowners. The domestic threat was followed by the foreign threat. The great empires to the east and south coveted the small kingdoms of the east and the south. Coveted the small kingdoms of Judah and Israel for their critical geographic location as the land bridge between Asia and Africa, and also for their valuable agricultural products, grain, wine, and oil. Eventually, their armies seized the land, reduced the population to vassalage, and drove them into exile. The land mourned, as the prophets say. As we know, in ancient times and modern, land and people alike are victims of imperial consumption and destruction. Putting these 5 elements together, I conclude that the biblical writers speak to and for a genuinely agrarian culture. And that is a primary reason the Bible speaks into our own time with forceful challenge. For most or all of us live in an industrialized culture that shares none of these basic assumptions about the character of land as a living creature, not a thing, a creature made by God, owned by God, entrusted by God to humans on the condition of wise and kindly use. Indeed, never has there been a dominant transnational culture so far removed from the material and economic understandings of the Bible as is our own urban-dominated culture. The North American writer Wendell Berry characterizes agrarians across time and in various places in ways that find deep resonance with the biblical narrative of land. Agrarians generally, quoting Berry, don't have or require a lot of the land, and the land they have is often marginal. They practice subsistence agriculture, which has been much derided by agricultural economists and other learned people in the industrial age. And they always, always associate frugality with abundance, end quote. The agrarian scale evaluation based on frugality as the key to abundance contrasts sharply with the industrial notion that abundance comes from the violation of limits, again quoting Berry, the violation of limits by personal mobility, extractive machinery, long-distance transport, and scientific or technological breakthrough. If we use up the good possibilities of this place, we will import goods from some other place, or we will go to some other place. If nature releases her wealth too slowly, we will take it by force, end quote. In the so-called growth economy of industrialism, those who lack mobility, affluence, and influence readily become jobless, homeless, destitute, and ill, as we see daily on our streets. The biblical writers were very familiar with this phenomenon. They called it exile. Let's now turn to a psalm that exemplifies ancient Israel's grounded mindset, its agrarian perspective on God and the world. One prefatory comment before we turn to Psalm 65. The Psalms altogether speak to and for people who know they are in trouble. Now, a lot of us know we are in trouble. And we are discovering a deep sanity in these texts that come to us from a world that knows and articulates a genuine alternative to the deracinated, rootless mindset of industrialism, and dares to extend its agrarian thinking to ultimate things, even to the nature of God. Psalm 65 is a remarkable portrait of God the agriculturalist, a farmer tending the fragile land of the hill country around Jerusalem, which for the biblical writers is the navel of the universe, the point of orientation for the whole created order. So reading Psalm 65. For the lead musician, a psalm, David's a song. To you, silence is praise, O God, in Zion, and to you vows are paid. O you who hear prayer, unto you all flesh comes. Reports of wrongdoing overwhelm me. Our transgressions, it is you who atone for them. Silence is praise. This is a strange idea, deeply countercultural in our noisy world. We'll return to it shortly. And then comes a confession of sin addressed to Shomer Tfilah, the one who hears prayer. This is a confession of corporate sin, our transgressions, b'sha'enu. All of us are implicated. I would infer that the psalm reflects an historical moment somewhat like our own, when humans need to stop talking and texting and tweeting, fall silent and engage in some serious repentance. It is telling how the prayer unfolds after that confession of massive and widespread wrongdoing. It is well with the one you choose and allow to come near, who dwells in your courts. May we be satisfied with the goodness of your house, the holiness of your temple. With fearsome works in righteousness, you respond to us, O God of our salvation, confidence of all the ends of the earth and the most distant sea. May we be satisfied, nisba'ah. This too is a striking idea. The implication is, this is a prayer, the implication is that satisfaction is not a natural response. It is a spiritual gift, one we have to pray for, and likewise a spiritual discipline. Is any prayer more needed in our time when the whole earth is groaning under the burden of the constant, widespread, and insatiable desire for more? This is a pilgrim psalm that orients and reorients those who pray it to Zion and to the house of God, whether or not any of us will ever see Jerusalem. And surely none of us will ever see the temple that once stood there. But what the psalmist perceives is that if we really trust to God's provision, then our ceaseless craving can, in fact, be satisfied. In God's manna economy, sufficiency is abundance. Notably, it is through God's work in creation that we receive a response to our prayer for satisfaction. And here I want to underscore the word righteousness, tzedek, in Hebrew. It is a thoroughly relational term denoting the condition of harmony and sustainability within the created order. Each creature in proper relation to every other creature, human and non-human, and also in proper relation to the Creator. Here the psalmist suggests that God's fearsome work in creation is itself the just response to that prayer. North American Christians, at least, tend to be uneasy with the notion of fearing God. We like to be comfortable in our faith, but the ancients were sturdier. They understood that if you do not tremble when God's power manifests itself, then you are not paying attention. When you see the vast discrepancy in power, wisdom, and goodness between God and ourselves, even in ordinary actions like sunrise and sunset, then some degree of reverent fear is the appropriate response. And note that the theme of wise and wholesome fear continues as the psalmist moves deeper into God's creative work. He sets firm Mechin mountains in his strength. He is girded with might. He stills the roar of the seas, the roar of their waves, and the din of nations. Those dwelling at earth's ends feel holy fear at your signs. The horizons of morning and evening you make ring with joy. This is the macro level of creation, the ordering of the earth. The psalmist might be meditating on the first chapter of Genesis as dry land emerges from the waters. Sun and moon are set in place to rule day and night and provide regularity to the seasons. This happened in the beginning, as Genesis tells us, and it is also creatio continua. We exist, we thrive, rejoice, because those rhythms continue day by day. But when they are disturbed, as we see increasingly now, then the nations begin to fall into chaos. Note also this phrase, he sets firm mountains in his strength. That will be echoed shortly as the psalmist turns to the micro level of creation with this description of God's exquisite care for soil and crops. You visit the earth and water it. abundantly you enrich it. God's stream full of water, you set their grain, the same phrase, tachin, just so you set it. There is a correspondence between the macro and the micro levels of creation, setting mountains in place, setting grain in the seed heads. And now the poet describes how God in Zion adapts farming practices suited to that particular territory with its steep slopes and thin layer of rich soil. Drenching its furrows, settling its hillocks, you soften it with showers, its growth you bless. You crown the year with your goodness, and your wagon tracks drip richness. Had anyone else ever imagined God like that? Driving the wagon at harvest time with so much grain that it's falling off onto the wagon tracks. The farmers of the Jerusalem Hill Country, who were the first hearers of this psalm, must have been encouraged, inspired to recognize that in their daily work of nurturing seed, harvesting water with stone terraces, they were carrying out God's own work, performing imitatio Dei, with this result. Wilderness pastures are dripping, and hills are belted with gladness. Meadows are clothed with the flocks, and valleys cloaked in grain. They shout out. Yes, they sing. A psalm that begins as a confession of sin, addressed to God in Zion, now concludes with a picture of the immediate and essential source of Zion's blessing, the fertile but very fragile agrarian landscape surrounding Jerusalem. Psalm 65 is a culturally appropriate icon, and that does not diminish its religious import. By highlighting this aspect of God's nochaot, fearsome works, awesome things, it showed Israelite farmers, both men and women, how, with their daily care, they participate in God's ongoing work of creation. In the image of this psalm, attuning their ears to the song of the created order. To conclude, the overwhelming majority of my nation's population no longer farms, nor, and this is much worse, nor do most of us have any idea of what constitutes good farming and good care for the various places we inhabit. This iconic psalm evokes the sacredness of ordinary space, all the places in and from which we live, and likewise the sacredness of ordinary work done with care and gratitude for God's work. It evokes, in the words of the poet-farmer Wendell Berry, the possibility of human life whose terms are heavens and this earth. The Farm is the longest of Berry's many Sabbath poems. In 14 pages, it details all the work of the agricultural year. Berry's poem might well serve as a local commentary on Psalm 65. Work done in gratitude, kindly and well, is prayer. This is not work for hire. By this expenditure, you make yourself a place. You make yourself a way for love to reach the ground. In its ambition and its greed, its violence, the world is turned against this possibility, and yet the world survives by the survival of this kindly, working love. God's creative and covenantal love reaches the ground through human work done in gratitude. Iron Age and contemporary, these two poets share the understanding that gratitude is the creaturely response to grace. God's grace and our gratitude work together on terms that are not ours alone, but heaven's and this earth. May we, through our own work, help to name the terms whereby humans, for generations to come, may fit practices to place, and thus discover or recover our own graced place within the created order. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ellen. We now have some good time for conversation and questions, and you will note that in the toolbar on the bottom of your screen, there is a place for you to ask a question. So I ask you just to go there and raise your hand when you have a question, or if you're having trouble with that, you can also just sort of wave your hand and I will call to you to raise your question. I'd like to start with a question for you, Ellen, because I know that in your teaching of the Hebrew Scriptures, you meet a number of students who obviously have no connection with agricultural work. And this is a question that's been in my mind for a very long time, and that is, when people do not have an understanding of agricultural realities and don't really have an appreciation for the kind of work, the practices that you ended your talk about that make love touch the ground, right? Those kinds of skills, how does that either, well, maybe deform is too strong of a word, but how does that then affect the way we read Scripture more broadly, right? If the people who give us these scriptural texts are such agriculturally minded people, and their sympathies and their imaginations are shaped by agricultural realities, for people who are urban, how does that affect then the way they think about the nature of God and the nature of God's mission in the world in our own time? Do you have some help that you can give us about what you do with students?
Or what I do with myself, because of course I did not, you grew up in Southern Alberta, working on a farm. I did not. I grew up on an island in the San Francisco Bay. So I didn't grow up in a strictly urban context all of my life. I did live in the city for some of it, but certainly a peri-urban context. And so anything that I have learned about this, I learned from my friends. And I, such as you and Wes Jackson and Wendell Berry. And I would say, in a sense, our students, because you and I share students, I think our students come in with a much higher level of initial awareness on the whole than I did when I started this work. And I first began getting a clue about it when I heard Wes Jackson give a lecture at Yale, and this would go back to probably around 1989, something like that. And he gave a lecture in which he talked about, it was at the forestry school, the School of the Environment at Yale, nothing to do with theology. But Wes is a biologist, an evolutionary biologist, and he thinks in terms of millennia. This is very helpful to me as a biblical scholar. And I remember his talking about the degradation of soil over the 10 to 12,000 years before present of monoculture and settled agriculture. And when someone begins thinking in terms of millennia, it gets my attention. I figure it can't be a very big problem if it hasn't existed for a few millennia at least. So then, just with that, in a sense, small hint, I simply began to read these texts again that I'd read countless times. But so often when I am teaching, the very first thing I do is say to my students, read the first 11 chapters of the Bible and see how many times land, soil, or the elements thereof, the elements of land in the sense that we talked about it with Aldo Leopold, how many times those words occur? And for most of them, of course, they're all over the place, but most of the students hadn't noticed that before. Now, I'm guessing, it's been a few years since I've given that assignment, I'm guessing that more people come with that awareness due to the sort of work largely that you've been doing than they did before. But I also, I suppose the most important thing I would say is talk to people who know more than you do. So for most of our students, that means talk to your elders. We live in a region of the United States that is only fairly recently deeply urbanized in North Carolina. This is actually harder to teach when I lived in Connecticut, which is a more deeply urbanized area over a longer period of time. But in this part of the world, I say to people, how many of your grandparents raise some significant portion of their own food? And usually a lot of hands go up. And how many of your parents do? And how many of you are doing that? And it's quite interesting to see the variation, but there's more response to the last of those. How many of you expect to be doing some of that than there was 10 or 15 years ago?
Yeah.
So it's a very dynamic environment.
Yeah, no, and that's very helpful. And I think it's also just important to help people understand that the very character of urban life has changed so dramatically over time, such that in ancient cultures around the world, whatever we described as urban was still very closely attuned to land realities. And so the imaginations and sympathies that readers would have had, they would have dialed in much more quickly the kinds of things that these texts are talking about. Whereas so many of the forms of urban experience today have really severed any connection with the land, so that when you were reading earlier from Genesis about how to interpret, how to translate the passage in the Garden of Delight about tend and till, right? And you say, no, let's talk about serve and observe, or perhaps even serve and obey, right? That must strike so many people as almost incomprehensible, because they wouldn't really have the kind of connection in which touching the ground so as to try to cultivate it as to produce food or fiber or whatever we need. So that then the question becomes, how do we introduce people to these practices? Would you advocate that for us to read in an agrarian sort of way these texts, we need to also cultivate in people something like agrarian practices of serving land, serving soil, serving watersheds, perhaps even serving urban neighborhoods, as a way to come to some understanding of the sort of agricultural character of the God of ancient Israel?
Well, I'm certainly not going to say no to you on that. And your work has been immensely helpful in giving people concrete steps for that. And I think, again, I'm thinking of the particular place where we live, Durham, North Carolina, where some of those issues are being addressed in an urban context, and even, again, more so than they were a decade or so ago, with food deserts, with cooperative grocery stores growing up in food deserts, with a very robust farmers market, with a number of people growing, including you, growing food in their garden, having chickens and bees on city blocks. So I think all of this changes the way we perceive our relationship to food and land and non-human creatures.
Thank you.
I would say that what you have just quite accurately said, Susanna, points to the multiple layers in these texts and the multiple angles of vision we need to bring to bear on them. I would say another factor, and for me, an absolutely critical one with respect to Deuteronomy, is when is it written, and when does it sort of hit the ground? Probably somewhere around the 7th century, when Israel itself is is under the vassalage of the imperial of Assyria, and so I wouldn't exactly call it a metaphor, but maybe an analogy to the opposition to the Canaanites, which in that context represent empire. Now the empire is Assyria. It's a complicated argument, and I think one that probably we can't spend a lot of time with. I've written about this in my book, Opening Israel's Scriptures, at greater length. But so I deliberately wouldn't use that text as a way of getting into this issue. I would choose, that's why I choose the 8th century prophets, because I think they are articulating very clearly, in a transparent way, the experience of people on the ground under the thumb of the expansion of empire. I think that may be, in this context, the best I can do right now. But I would say not every text is for every moment, or for every question that is brought. So as you know, there is a very rich Jewish tradition of reading that exception, the Bal Tashchit, do not destroy. But within Deuteronomy, and maybe I think that's maybe the best I can do with it at this point. I'm going to thank you very much. I'm going to take your what you've just said more by way of a comment than a question, because I think you have clearly pointed to what we need to be doing and what is in many contexts being done in terms of teaching children a different way of perceiving the world on which their lives depend. And certainly the primary school teachers I know are all in one way or another engaged in that task. I would say that by the time students come to me, I often think in this matter, it's almost too late. I mean, it isn't too late because they do change, but it needs to keep happening earlier and earlier. And as I say, I think it genuinely is. I think, Norman, you would know more about this than I. You have a daughter who teaches very young children. Is this present in the school system in which Anna teaches?
Well, it's difficult because, schools right now are in these contexts of fear. And so there's an effort to actually sort of sequester students, seclude them, to protect them more and more. And so the possibilities of taking them outdoors to have a direct experience with natural realities, or created realities, to use that term, is much more of a challenge. And it's a serious concern, I think. I would like to follow up on Ibrahim's observation by talking about how, in traditions, there is this talk about there's the book of scripture, but also there's the book of nature, and both need to be read together, right? So that apart from reading them together, we might misread the one or the other. And I think, on the one hand, when we don't reach the book of nature with the book of scriptures, however whatever scriptural text we take on, we lose the sense of the deep spiritual meaning, the subjective liveliness of created realities. And at the same time, if we read the scriptures without also reading the book of nature or the book of creation, we end up with an understanding which is so much cognitive rather than fully sensorial, right? A world to be touched and tasted and smelled and so forth. I'm wondering if you're thinking about how these two books might complement each other as we try to interpret the one or the other. And then I think, Ibrahim, you had a follow-up comment, is that correct?
The only thing I would add to that is that there also needs to be a conversation amongst urbanites and people from more traditional cultures, urbanites and people who are very much involved with the land. I think this is certainly within the academy in the US. It's been an urban-dominated conversation, and the notion of other kinds of knowledge, I think, other kinds of knowledge have been devalued. And there has been in some, I know this is true in Christian contexts, and I think possibly in some Jewish contexts, and some of you would be able to speak to that. I think there has been a fear that paying attention to the book of nature leads in the direction of what's often called paganism. That it's contrary to the basic understandings of the faith. And I think that's something that certainly for people in my generation, in certain Christian contexts, that needs to be addressed head on, I think.
Yeah. Just to go alongside that, Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was a very important agricultural educator in the early part of the 20th century United States, spent a lot of time with farmers and discovered that he found in these people a sense that there could be a kind of humility because they recognized that they were the dispensers of holy mysteries of life and death, the gratuity of life, the fragility of life, but also the surprise and the beauty of life. And I know it's dangerous to romanticize agricultural communities because they have historically also been places of xenophobia and racism and such. But do you think that there's something about the experience of being an agricultural person, agricultural workers, that simply opens you up to some dimensions about our experience that are unavailable to people, perhaps, who don't share in that work?
I know we need to end. I feel like a radio announcer in the 60 seconds remaining. So I will just say, I don't think there is something that simply opens you up. Mm-hmm. I think there is that possibility. But I also think that, and I've encountered this in North America and the US, and also in East Africa and a number of the Great Lakes nations, that there is a way of teaching Bible and promulgating religious instruction that shuts down those perceptions. And I have found in both those places that when I offer a different kind of reading of familiar texts, often people say, we didn't know that there was something in the Bible that actually addresses our situation. Not only our knowledge of the land, but also the threats that we are experiencing, the kind of thing I was articulating with the 8th century prophets. So I don't think it's a simple thing, but yes, I do think that people who know the land feel the fragility of their situation more readily than many of us do who are cushioned by our and diluted by our urban context.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen, for sharing with us during this hour. It's been
Thank you very
a
much.
real pleasure to engage with you.